deal that we wrote on racial discrimination in housing, which led to our current situation, from your Sacramento Arts and Revolution. The city government's ongoing housing
policy perpetuates and devastatingly intensifies systematic racism. We've come here before to discuss how it is that elected public policy leaders like yourself, with apparently no conscious agendas of racism or white supremacy or collaboration or enablement of such, can enact and maintain policies which have an intensely racist and white supremacist outcome. We've discussed in broad terms what are the practical and moral consequences of these policies and outcomes. Today, we would like to illustrate in more specific detail of the historic processes and outgoing effects of current policy which produce our present practical and moral crisis. What is systematic racism? It is a system in which public policies, institutional practices, cultural representations, perceptions, and practices, and other norms work in various, often reinforcing ways to perpetuate racial group inequity. It identifies dimensions of our history and culture that have allowed privileges associated with whiteness and disadvantages associated with color to endure and adapt over time.
Systemic racism is not something that a few people or institutions choose to practice. Instead, it has been a feature of the social, economic, and political system in which we all exist. The term structural racism is often used interchangeably with systemic racism. It is most often practically synonymous. If there is a difference between the terms, it can be said to exist in the fact that structural racism, as an analytical term, pays more attention to the historical, cultural, and social psychological aspects of our currently racialized society. Thank you.
Thank you. If you want to leave a copy of that.
Eric G. and then Suzanne Hastings.
Hello. I'm Eric G. with your Sacramento Art Revolution. Systematic racism or structural racism are rooted deeply in the historic reality of our society. This means that archaic institutions like bond servitude, slavery, the predatory sharecropper system, and Jim Crow laws have in practical terms resisted the force of legal abolition and adapted and morphed into new institutions, or mostly and most insidiously into successive practices and psychological perspectives and habits of thought, which assume the power of substance of formal institutions. Here in Sacramento, in terms of the modern history of our housing market, the city was shaped by racial segregation through the legal institution of racially restrictive covenants.
Legal documents that enforce racial discrimination in housing have restricted people of color to racially segregated, material marginalized, under-resourced, and critically undeserved neighborhoods. We might point to a number of policies and practices which resources were restricted in neighborhoods like those of the West End were marginalized. Most important was the notorious practice of redlining. The specific practice called redlining began with the National Housing Act of 1934, which established the Federal Housing Administration. Redlining soon became an almost universal adopted practice by white-owned banks, home lending institutions, and government housing programs. Stated simply, redlining is a practice of denying services, either directly or through selectively raising prices to residents of certain areas based on the racial and ethnic composition of those areas. Perhaps the most critical examples of redlining have involved denial of home and mortgage lending, but also include financial services such as banking or insurance, and then other services such as healthcare or even supermarkets that have been denied to residents of redline communities.
Home lending institutions and government housing programs. Simply stated, redlining is the practice of denying services either directly or through selectively raising prices to residents of certain areas based on the racial or ethnic composition of those areas.
Here, your testimony is up, and it sounds like you have a whole lot more.
I
Would you like to leave a copy of that with the clerk?
Yes, sir.
All of us can get it and read it at our own leisure.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you.
Next speaker is Suzanne Hastings, and then Les White.
Good evening, City Council. The city's government also housing policy actuates and devastatingly intensifies systematic structural racism. Psychological aspects of our currently racialized society. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next speaker is Les White, and then Michael, and I believe the last one is Melissa.
You were a little out of order here. Okay, with racially restricted covenants and red lines, residents of these segregated neighborhoods hoping to buy homes had to buy into predatory contract agreements.
With racially restrictive covenants and redlining, the residents of segregated neighborhoods hoping to buy homes had to buy into predatory contract agreements. High cost, high interest with arbitrary added costs, and if the non-white homebuyers could not keep up the payments, they lost everything they had invested. They had no equity. So contract agreements were really designed so that the home buyers would fail and the seller lenders would keep their money and sell and lend on the same property over and over again. In this way, the community in general was plundered and deteriorated, and property there lost value. Our schools and other vital social services, but most particularly our schools, are funded by local property taxes. Where property values are low, schools and community services are underfunded. In the 1950s, the city government and influential business interests targeted the West End for urban renewal. The Federal Housing Act of 1949 was supposed to provide federal money to provide quality low-income housing. Initially, the Sacramento City Planning Office announced its urban renewal program would provide new affordable housing to replace slums, but soon eliminated the promised new affordable housing from its plan. Contract agreement home buyers in the West End found effectively they did not have ownership rights to their homes that were sold out from under them by their predatory lenders to the city and new property investors. Federal money was used to remove existing residential property and develop new expensive commercial property for white-owned businesses that now moved into the West End, now referred to by property developers and city officials as the redevelopment survey area. Renters were pressured out by rising rents and the continuous elimination of residential property. For decades, residents organized against the redevelopment policy.
Now referred to by the property developers and the city officials as the redevelopment survey area. Renters were pressured out by rising rents and continuous elimination of residential property.
Thank you. If you'd like to leave a copy of the document for us to read at our leisure, we would enjoy having that.
By the 1970s, the population of the formerly redlined West End was evicted. The displaced residents of the West End moved and resettled to what neighborhoods were not restricted by racial covenants, most notably Oak Park and county land to the south of it, and to remote neighborhoods in the north side of the county. These areas quickly became segregated neighborhoods again, redlined by banks and housing lenders, oppressed with the same treatment and predatory contract lending practices and all the other problems of the old West End. The experience of being displaced from one's home neighborhood in such distressed circumstances and often into even more difficult housing conditions and social conditions took a bitter toll on the resegregated population. During this time, over 90% of the rental market in the Sacramento area remained closed off to non-whites, creating a critical shortage of housing for people of color. Today, looking back 50 years to the long, hot summer of 1967, when 159 uprisings and race riots swept across cities throughout the United States, we would do well to remember that. As with the Watts riots, housing discrimination and acute neighborhood overcrowding were again and again cited as key factors in provoking this violent civil unrest. The federal Fair Housing Law, enacted as Title VIII of the Civil Rights Act of 1968, made it illegal to discriminate in selling and renting housing because of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin, and yet redlining and contracting home sales agreements persisted everywhere. Racial restricted covenants were no longer legally enforceable, but in the informal habits of housing discrimination went on as before. Over the past 5 decades, the Fair Housing Act has seldom been enforced here.
We would enjoy having that.
Our next speaker is Michael Hansen, then Brenda Flowers, and our last speaker is Sarah Michael.
Thank you. The difference in income between black and white households has hardly changed at all in 50 years, since the day the Fair Housing Act became law. On average, a white American has 5 times the wealth of the average black American. The average white American household is worth 20 times as much as the average black household. For the American middle class and working class, home ownership is the key access to wealth, and without it, African Americans were refused the chance to save and build assets to pass on to the next generation.
The difference in income between black and white households has hardly changed at all in the 50 years since the day the Fair Housing Act became law. In the United States, while the income of the average black adult is 60% of the average white adult, the average white American has 5 times the wealth of the average black American. The average white American household is worth 20 times as much as the average black household. For the American middle class and working class, home ownership is the key access to wealth, and without it, African Americans were refused the chance to save and build assets to pass on to the next generation. Inequality of wealth means an inequality of opportunity and quality of life that is so severe that it seems now a permanent and essential condition of life in Sacramento, as it is in America in general. More recently, Sacramento's circumstances of racialized segregation and inequality have been further worsened by the effects of subprime lending. Over time, since the ratification of Title VIII of the Civil Rights Act, the old discriminatory, predatory, and ruinous contract lending practices have been abandoned. This has raised the need or opportunity for a new approach to home lending in segregated low-income neighborhoods. Gradually, the home lending establishment developed the subprime lending system to offer special mortgage products based on so-called risk-based pricing. Ostensibly, there are mortgages charging interest and fees according to the risk of default, not the race of the home buyer. But the risk is, of course, scored very high in racially segregated neighborhoods, burdened by the history of racial covenants, redlining, discrimination, and refused opportunity. Professor Jesus Hernandez of the University of California, Davis, has done a highly detailed study showing how subprime lending has been overwhelmingly concentrated and marketed at the same neighborhoods that were historically contained by redlining and racial covenants.
Professor Hernandez of the University of California, Davis, has done a highly detailed study showing how subprime lending has been overwhelmingly concentrated and target marketed at the same neighborhoods that were historically contained by redlining and racial covenants. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yay.
Brenda Flowers, and Sarah Michael.
Awesome, Brenda. Thank you.
My name is Brenda Flowers. I'm one of the homeless in this community, and I'm working with San Francisco Housing Operating Committee and those officials. Subprime mortgages impose useless interest arrangements and fees on individuals and families attempting to buy homes in the segregated neighborhood where historic exclusion has put them. Subprime mortgages, by their nature, inflict high rates of foreclosure and loss of equity. This is in communities from which wealth is extracted, not to which it is accumulated. This is again the brutal reality of systemic racism. Now, as the actual space of these neighborhoods is transformed by fast rise of rents and gentrification, which is impacted the hardest by your high rent increases. Who is impacted the hardest by the displacements of gentrification? What sorts of neighborhoods will these people be able to locate to? Your market rate housing displaces working people and into desperate circumstances, but most onerous of people of color. Most honestly, it affects people of color. The paltry number of affordable housing units we may even hope to see will be situated with the most difficult access to employment and social and civic resources. Your housing policy drives conditions of ever greater inequity and privation, conditions which generate conflict and balance. The balance is for the most part the balance of marginalized against the marginalized, seemingly random, incoherent, and self-interest. The police are expected to enforce public order, but this is a public order embedded in the system of racism. How can we expect the relationship between the police and the distressed communities they patrol to be anything but toxic and deadly? Today, Sacramento's housing policy is commanded by vast accumulations of wealth and capital in the hands of real estate investment and development interests and property management consumers. One has.
I'm sorry, but your time is up, and as I said to the other speakers, if you'd like to leave us a copy so we can read this incomplete, I would encourage you to do so.
Subprime mortgages impose usurious interest arrangements and fees on individuals and families attempting to buy homes in the segregated neighborhoods where historic exclusion has put them. Subprime mortgages, by their nature, inflict high rates of foreclosure and loss of equity. This is in communities from which wealth is extracted, not to which it is accumulated. This is again the brutal reality of systemic racism. Now, as the actual space of this neighborhood is transformed by fast rising rents and gentrification, who is impacted the hardest by your high rent increases? Who is impacted the hardest by the displacement of gentrification? What sorts of neighborhoods will they be able to relocate to? Your market rate housing displaces working people in desperate circumstances, but most onerously on people of color. The paltry number of affordable housing units we might even hope to see will be situated with the most difficult access to employment and social and civic resources. Your housing policy drives conditions of ever greater inequality and privation, conditions which generate conflict and violence. The violence is, for the most part, the violence of marginalized against the marginalized, seemingly random, incoherent, and self-injurious. The police are expected to enforce public order. But this is a public order embedded in the systemic racism you perpetuate. How can we expect the relationship between the police and the distressed communities they patrol to be anything but toxic and deadly? Today, Sacramento's housing policy is commanded by vast accumulations of wealth and capital in the hands of real estate investment and development interests. In property management concerns, one has to wonder how much of that wealth and capital is derived and handed down from the past accumulation and hoarding of predatory lending, redlining, and racial restrictive covenants. Public policy with a racist outcome is a racist policy. Thank you for your time and attention.